In this session, we will discuss string bean. What is a string bean? Okay, let's first of all, before understanding string bean, first of all, we try to understand what means a POJO class. What means a POJO? POJO. POJO stands for plain old Java object. What stands for POJO? POJO stands for plain old Java object. It means when you define any Java class, when you define any Java class where we are not following any convention, we are not following any standard conventions, that classes is known as POJO, plain old Java objects. Yes, no? Any class. So class can have anything. Yes, no? You can define any class without any standard convention. That class act as a plain old Java object. POJO classes. These are POJO classes. But now understand what is a bean. Which class is known as bean? Bean is nothing, it is a Java POJO class also. A Java POJO class is called as a bean when a Java POJO class follows some standard convention. When Java POJO class follows some standard convention, that class is known as Java bean. What standard? First standard is means class contains all private property. Class contains what property? Contains all private property. It means all the property that we have declared inside a class, that property we need to make as a private. Contains all private properties. Second one, to access private property, we have getter and setter method. So we have getters and we have setters. We have getters and setters for accessing those properties. Now next, a class has public argument constructor, public zero argument constructor. And class must be implement serializable interface. Serializable interface. The class which follow these are standard convention, that class is called as a Java bean class. Any POJO class, any Java POJO class which follow these are standard, and that POJO class we can call as a Java bean. So what is a POJO? POJO class is any Java class. Any Java class that you have defined is known as POJO class. But a POJO class which follows this some standard convention, that POJO class become bean. Now, what is a spring bean then? Okay. A bean, we can say a bean which can, whose life cycle, a bean whose life cycle, whose life cycle can be managed by spring container. This means the bean whose life cycle will managed by spring container, that bean is called as spring bean. A spring bean is nothing, it just it is also bean, but the bean whose life cycle will managed by spring container, that bean is called as a spring bean. Okay, when you define any class, suppose, let's understand here. Here, I'm define here a class. In this, what here? First up, understand the structure here. Here we have src main Java. Under that, we have folder com.example.demo. Under this folder, we have boot class. This is a start class here. Under the same folder, let's we create one class. I'm created one class. Just give the class name like customer class. I give the customer class. Okay, here we create a customer class. Who is responsible for creating the object for this class? Who will responsible manage the life cycle of customer object? If This bean life cycle will managed by the container. That bean is called as spring bean. Okay, let's now here we are fetching we run the applications. Sorry. When we run this application, we will check here customer bean is created or not created. So from the container here we have container. We ask to the container for customer bean. Yes, no. So container dot we have method in the container get bean method. Which method? Get bean method. Get bean method what return? It will return the bean name. Yes, it will return the bean. Yes, no. By the specified bean. Which bean we are expecting? We are expecting the customer bean. We are expecting which type bean? Customer bean. Yes, no. So now it will return one customer bean object. Okay, let's watch here. Here we able to create or not. So now we need to typecast it because get bean method returns object type value. Now we are trying to print customer. Now save it again. And now here you can check here. Here you will get the error. What the error? No such bean definitions customer available. No bean named customer available. Actually, this class is not treated as a spring bean. So when we can represent Java bean as a spring bean, how we can represent represent Java bean as a spring bean. Which bean is known as a spring bean? The bean whose life cycle will managed by the spring container, that bean is known as a spring bean. When you define any class, suppose I'm defining any bean, suppose customer bean here we are defining. So can we say this is a spring bean? How you can represent Java bean as a spring bean? If you want to represent Java bean as a spring bean, we need to annotate Java bean by the following annotation. Okay. How we can represent Java bean as a spring bean? To represent Java bean as a spring bean, the corresponding bean needs to be annotated with following annotations. Which following annotations? Okay, let's understand. Stereotype annotation. Okay, following bean needs to be annotated for following annotation. One is annotation at the rate component annotations, at the rate service annotation, at the rate repository annotation, okay, at the rate controller annotations, controller annotations, at the rate rest controller annotation, and at the rate bean annotation. So we can say we can represent Java bean as a string bean if the corresponding class is annotated by the following annotation. These are annotation is known as stereotype annotation. What is a stereotype annotation? Stereotype annotation is nothing. It is a annotations which represent the role, which define the role of a class. Suppose if any class which contain the business logic. Suppose I have defined here customer service class. Customer service class what contain? Customer service class contain the business logic. This is a customer service class which contain the business logic. If the class is annotated at the rate service annotation, actually this class contains business logic. Now we are annotating this class by using at the rate service annotation. So it means if any class which is annotated at the rate service annotations, that class contains business logic. Here this is a stereotype annotation which tells the role of a class. Actually, what is the role of the each corresponding class? Yes, no? What customer service play role actually? Customer service contains what? Business logic. So that's why here we annotate a class using @service annotation. If any class which is annotated @service annotation, it means that class contains business logic. If any class which contains the business logic, that class we need to annotate @service annotation. Suppose repository. Suppose if any class contains DAO layer, DAO data access object logic, persistence logic, that class we need to annotate @repository annotation. So stereotype annotation just tell the role of the Java bean. So if any Java bean which is represented, which is annotated the following annotation, that Java bean treated as a Spring Bean. So what here we define one customer class, but for customer class, customer bean, Spring container will not create an instance. If you try to run this application, you will get the error, no bean named customer available. When container will create an instance for this bean, when we are representing this bean as a Spring Bean. How we can represent this bean as a Spring Bean? We can represent this bean as a Spring Bean by annotating corresponding class by using stereotype annotation. When the corresponding class annotated is stereotype annotation, that class treated as a Spring Bean. When class treated as a Spring Bean, for that class, who will create the instance for that class? Spring container responsible for creating the instance for that class, and Spring container responsible for managing the life cycle of that bean. Okay, let's try to understand here. Now we are annotate this class. Okay, now what's here? Here we annotate this class @component annotation. I'm annotating this class @component annotation. Component. You can check here component annotation. Let's in this class we define constructor. Yes, no? When object is created, constructor will invoke. Yes, no? Let's we define a constructor. Which class? Customer class. Okay, let's here we define a constructor inside the class public customer constructor. Now here we write the code system.out.println customer constructor. Customer constructor. So now you can check here. Okay. Okay, now stop this application. Now here we stop this application. Again run this application. Okay. So now again we run this application. Run as Java application. Okay. 1 minute. I'm just comment this line. I'm not asking for object first of all. Okay. I'm not asking any object for the container. Okay, let's first of all run this application and check the output. When you launch the application, when you start the application, Spring Boot application is bootstrap. Yes, no? Okay, at the same time, you can check here. One application is bootstrap. Yes, no? Container will create the instance. Yes, no? You can check here. Container will create the instance for which class? For customer class. Actually, customer class we treated as a Spring Bean. Yes, no? You can check here. Customer class we treated as a Spring Bean. Now, who will create the object for this bean? We have not created the object for this bean. Who will create the object for this bean? Container will create. Now, this class life cycle will manage by the container. Now, this class we represent as a Spring Bean. Once you represent the class as a Spring Bean, now who will responsible to create the instance for this class? Container will responsible to create the object for this class. So it means now the class which is managed by the IOC is called Spring Bean. Which class is called as a Spring Bean? Now customer class is act as a Spring Bean. The class which is managed by the IOC is called Spring Bean. Which class you can represent as a Spring Bean? To represent a Java class as a Spring Bean, the corresponding Java class needs to be annotated using stereotype annotation. If any class which is annotated at stereotype annotation, that class lifecycle will manage by the Spring container. A Spring container will manage the life cycle of that class. Now here we create a customer class. Customer class we have just created, but who will create the instance for this class? Who will create the instance for this class? The instance will be created by the container. Container will responsible to create the instance for this class. Okay, let's now we create here one more class. Let's now here we create one more class, dbutil class. Now finish it. Just we define a constructor inside this class. I'm defining the constructor inside this class. Let's we define the constructor inside this class. Now for this class, you can check here. If you now we stop this application, you can check here how many beans you have defined. You have defined two beans. One is a customer beans, another is a dbutil bean. But when you container started, container creates how many beans object? You can check here. It will create an object for customer at dbutils. Now watch here. You can check here. Now only which bean will be created? Customer bean will be created. You can check here. Only customer bean. For password, for date util class, it will not create an instance because this class is not treated as a Spring Bean. So if you want to manage the life cycle of this class also by the Spring container, IOC container, now corresponding class also we need to annotate following stereotype annotation. Let's now we annotate this class also at the rate component annotation. What is the at the rate component annotation? We can say this is a annotations, indicate annotation, a class is a component. Such classes are considered as a candidates for auto deductions. Auto deduction, it means if any class is annotated by the stereotype annotation, that class auto detected and container will create the instance for those classes because those classes represent as a string bean. Container will create the instance for those beans which beans represented as a string bean. How we can represent Java bean as a string, Java class as a string bean? How we can represent? To represent Java class as a string bean, Java class needs to be annotated following annotation. Here we are annotate date util class using at the rate component annotation. Component annotation we can say it is a generic class annotation. Sorry, generic annotation means if any class, yes, no, which contain any specific logic. Actually, if you annotate any class at the rate service annotation, this means that class contain which type logic? That class contain business logic. If any class is annotated at the rate repository annotation, this means that class contain persistence logic. But if any class annotated at the rate component annotation, this means that class contain what? Any general logic, any specific logic, you can say. Okay, here now if you try to run, here you can check here for both classes. Yes, no? For both classes instance is created. You can check here. Okay, let's now we save it and run it and we will check here. Okay, you can check here for dbutil and for customer, for both Java classes instance created. Who will manage the life cycle? Container will manage the life cycle. Clear? Now we define one more class. Suppose I am defining one more class. I am defining one car class. Let's a password util class. I'm defining one class password util class. Now we define one class password util class. You can check a password util. Now finish it. You can check here. Now in this password util class, I'm define annotate this class at the rate service annotation. Okay. Now when you start the container, you can check here how many beans object is created. There are 3 beans, new beans is created. You can check here customer date utils, and here we require password util. Okay, I'm not defining the constructor here. Here we define the constructor. Let's here define the constructor in password util class. Okay, let's save it, run it. Now you can check here. How many beans is created? There are 3 beans created. Customer class, date util class, password util class. Okay, let's now here we define one class. Let's suppose I define one class, car class. Okay. Now this car class, inside this car class, now we annotate this class at the rate component annotation. Component annotation. Now inside this class, let's we define the property. Suppose some services, some method, public void start method. Now here we write something statement this out car start. Now we define another method public void stop. Car stop. So here we define start car uh, and start method, stop method. Here we define car class. Okay, class is we are defining. Now who will be responsible to managing the life cycle of this car object? Container. Container will create the instance. Now with an application, if you require, you can use directly. Yes, no? Okay, suppose I want to use the car class functionality. So now ask the instance for the container dot we call the get beans get bean. Now here we need to pass the name of the bean. Which type bean we have required? Car type. Okay, now car dot second parameter we pass in car dot class. Which type bean required? Car type. Okay. Now what this method return? This method return the car type instance. Car car. Okay, let's now we print the car first of all. Car. Save it, run it. Okay, you can check here. You will get the car object. Yes. Okay. Now after getting the car object, if you want to use the car feature, so you can use the car feature car dot start. Yes. No? I want to stop the car dot car dot car dot stop. You can check it. So now watch here. Instance is already created. Yes. No. Whenever you require, anywhere you require within a project, you can use directly. Yes. No? You have not required to create the instance. You have not required to responsible to manage the life cycle for the car being. Who will manage? Container will take the responsibility. I'm only ready to use that instance. If you require, you can use directly. Clear?